So countries that are now expected to have to give preferential treatment to investment that is coming from GCC countries or countries that support them. Now, I would like to end my part with a very important question now, and adds to what Adeel said. The question is, will this lead to a better regional integration or not? Because we have on one hand the countries that are GCC that are still having surplus, even though their surplus is decreasing in the coming short period. But also, does it mean that maybe they redirect their investment towards the countries that are that needed this investment instead of supporting them in the fashion of grants and oil for free? Maybe they redirect their support towards investment, and that will lead to better regional cooperation or integration at best. Thank you.
Thank you, Samer. Thank you all. Very intriguing typology, very intriguing predictions, and Samer tried upon the end to give it a positive spin. Before we open it up to debate, which ultimately this is what we want to do, it's the Tahrir dialogue after all, I'm going to abuse my privilege as the moderator by taking the right to make the first question. Adeel talks about the pyramid of privilege that must be undone for this conundrum between employment versus autonomy to actually be healed in a positive sense. Ishaq sees that there is no escape from that. And Samer posits the point that we actually might not only not be able to escape it from the political economy point of view, which is what Ishaq concluded, but ultimately that choice, that luxury of choice might not be there as the price continues to drop. Saudi's break-even budgeting is at $85 per barrel, so we're there. For the rest of the Gulf countries, it's around 70s. For Iran, it's 140. They're budgeting at 140 and the price is 85. Is there a way to ensure that this undoing of the pyramid of privilege is done in a positive way that integrates the region, given the historical networks of privilege that you all touched upon? How do you give it a positive spin? Where do you start? The IMF is not going to be interfering, right? The political pressure of these countries is against undoing these pyramids of privilege. Is there a model in your mind of a success scenario that can be benchmarked against? Anybody?
I can try. I mean, look, $85 a barrel, it can go back to 100. I mean, it's just a few months. But let's also remember that these countries of the GCC have very deep pockets. They can wait. I mean, Saudi Arabia has what, $1 trillion of value just of public enterprises, another $1 trillion saved abroad, and so they can borrow. So they can go on for 10, 20 years. 10 in the worst case at $50, 20 at $80. You know, their challenge is medium term. And so again, as I said, these countries, these regimes can really look long term. And their interest, as always, is to open up the private sector. And you know, they are on a path where the private sector becomes, they have less profits. At the same time, the ruling class is becoming larger, so there are risks of more cronyism in the future and a less competitive system. But nevertheless, so far, it's a pretty competitive system with rule of laws. So they have everything they need to actually provide increased autonomy to the private sector and perhaps more political rights, more voice in the future. More voice in the shaping of policies. Now, the type 3, the Egypt of this world, have much less space, obviously. And we see it very, very well in Tunisia. I mean, in Tunisia, you know, parties that a priori I mean, the issue in these countries, of course, the short-term issue is this political vacuum that attracts enormous political energy to occupy that vacuum. But ultimately, as we've seen in today's election, actually, or yesterday's election in Tunisia, the system is becoming more competitive, and that should allow to move away from the chronism of the past to a more competitive political system that allows a more autonomous private sector. And so, again, we see some countries that are finding a solution. It's very hard to read the cards in Egypt. I mean, count on the audience to tell us what's going on.
Right. I think, and I will take a very broad view. I think before we exceptionalize the region, let's admit that these monopoly concessions, these restrictions, trade restrictions, are not just the exclusive preserve of the Middle East. As a matter of fact, I was watching a program yesterday in China. I was very sleepy in my hotel room, but I actually stayed long at night just to watch the complete program, because everything Chinese entrepreneurs were seeing reminded me of the Middle East. They said entrepreneurship, people don't look at them, with a favorable eye. The state gives us permits and everything. It was all a state-controlled system. And they were talking about really 25, 30 years ago. And the system has changed. I think ultimately we must recognize that elites nowhere in the world give concessions unless they're forced to. The problem I see in the Arab world since the Arab Spring is that there has been neither any major concession by the elite nor any discussion of the concession. So yes, we have seen lots of financial concessions, giving out more money to the people with the GCC, but there is no genuine political concession in terms of a competitive space to the private sector. And that usually comes when the state is fiscally dependent on the merchants. Imagine if the King of England in the 1700s or 1500s, if he were more dependent on the neighboring France for cash flows, he would have never given the rights to the merchants. That would have relieved space for the commoners, right? So what we see today is not just the failure of economic reform in Arab countries, it's the failure of a discourse on reform. Because, it's still very confused. We are not pinpointing, what really is the key issue. And I think unless that tipping point comes, and remember, the three countries we talk about that are growing very much, India, China, Turkey, these are countries that went through massive crises. In 1991, India really came to its heels. That's when a new political equilibrium emerged. Same thing goes for Turkey. And so, crony capitalism, we must also remember, is not just exclusively a preserve of the Middle East. You have crony capitalism everywhere. Even in the US, you have that kind of relationship. But who are the countervailing powers? Are there small, medium enterprises, new entrants who are actually constantly challenging them? But I think ultimately we have to talk about, okay, we know that Arab populations are very restive. The development model has failed them. They're agitated. Yes, now what is happening in the region through division, we can all sit quiet and say, well, we don't want to be like Syria, so let's stay here. But you can buy another 10 years. In 10 years' time, we are back to the same point. And therefore, we would still need to confront the question, and are there those questions being put on the table or not?
Well, it's a very good question. How do this pyramid of privileges stops or ceases being a pyramid? Well, there are two paths. There is the radical path where people mobilize and just reshape the whole political and economic system in a very radical way, which is the revolution pattern. And there is the table of negotiation, and people reach concessions, because no one would give a privilege for free. So the economic and the political elite would give away something in return to something else, because if it's too costly for them to sustain such a mechanism or such a system. So it always has to do with the table of negotiations. But In order to sit on the table of negotiation, you need to be strong enough to have a place on the table of negotiation. So the question is whether it's the chicken or the egg. You want to open up the political space so that there are more organized political and economic forces, whether coming from the private sector or from the public, that are strong enough to send a signal, we are here to sit on the table and negotiate new concessions. But they cannot do that in a closed public space. So it's very tricky whether you open up the space, but if you open up the space, it's going to create people who would like to sit on the table, but there is no other way to give away concessions other than either a dramatic, radical way through the revolution or through a negotiation table among peers.
Very good. In the spirit of talking about concessions, I'll concede my right to ask questions to the audience. Please, just a couple of rules about asking the questions. Introduce yourself. Limit it to 20 or 30 seconds. A question usually ends with a question mark. So not broad statements, but please, very pointed question. Gentleman there.
My name is Mohamad. I'm a journalist. Two quick questions. One, the reducing the price of oil, could that be motivated by Arab fears over the fracking technology in America, that kind of thing, trying to kill it in the net, so to speak? The other question is concerning the merchants and the relationship with the state. What about the merchants themselves? Are they united amongst themselves? Do they have any solidarity? Do they have rivalries, ethnic rivalries, religious rivalries, economic rivalries? Could that be part of the problem?
Regarding the first part of the question, Salman touched upon the fracking technology. I want to add a throw in. The Economic magazine this week talks about potentially lowering the price to the point of breaking the Iranian budget. So touch upon that as well.
Well, it's a political game, and it's also an economic game. As Mohamad mentions, maybe there is a political game to increase the pressure on the budget of Iran, dropping down the prices, reducing their revenues, creating economic pressure on their already strained budget. But also there is an economic play in this. You want to strategically, you want the price to go down so that people coming into the market will not be able to come into the market because the price is too low to cover their initial investment, especially if it's a new technology that requires a high price in order to pay back their investment. So there is possibly some sort of strategic behavior from the GCC in order not to reduce so they're not reducing their production in order to keep the price up. And as Ishaq said, maybe they have lots in their pocket, they could sustain a couple of years with a low price.
Ishaq and Adeel, would you touch upon, within these circles of privileges, how united are the merchants?
Well, quickly, Adeel is absolutely right. Concessions have to be one, and the few countries that have made it to be rich countries, and there aren't so many in the past century, maybe 15, all those where the private sector has brought and has acted as a class to extract concessions from the state. So this is the crux of the matter. And indeed, one doesn't see the private sector emerging as a class in most countries. And it has a lot to do with this dualistic nature of the private sector, it seems to me, where you have a large informal sector and then some very big firms and not a lot in the middle. So nobody really has the legitimacy to represent the private sector. We've seen something similar on labor, a lot of informal labor and some very well-paid formal private sector labor, and again, we don't get unions that represent the labor movement forcefully. And so the fact that we don't have this meso institution, if you like, on the side of capital and labor is something that's really missing in the road to extract those concessions.
Yeah. And in fact, that's one reason why Tunisia offers us a relatively more hopeful case, because the UGTT played a very important role right from the beginning. And I think I absolutely agree with you. All throughout the region, we have with varying degrees, horizontal associations are relatively weak. And it's a very deep question why that is the case. It's in part rooted in a long history of divide and rule. We must also not forget that merchants are usually fearful everywhere in the world of each other, and they don't cooperate unless they see the benefits of cooperation. And here you see the benefits are long term, but the short term benefits are very limited. Therefore, it's a very costly thing. As the classic corrective action failure that we find. But ultimately, as Ishaq is saying, you've got to have labor that kind of comes together as a class and makes its case for its rights, and also for the private sector. And I think a lot of what the World Bank and others are doing on private sector development, I sometimes feel it's a good idea to actually create collective associations for the informal sector. Now, there are hardly any studies on what does the Egyptian informal sector mean. Who are they? What is their sociological mapping? Of course, there are a lot of economics-oriented studies about their size, but it's all, the definition is always firms that do not register, that do not pay taxes. That's a very restricted definition. Where are they located? What is their social location, economic location, ideological location? And unless we understand more of that, it's extremely difficult for us to understand the reasons for lack of cooperation.
Indeed. Sir.
My name is Dr. Ezi. I will ask two questions related to what you said and what he said. Saudi Arabia, I'm a feminist, so Saudi Arabia said in 3 or 4 years we will allow the women to vote and get voted for in the local council, which has zero power. So trying to not to the Western states, we're going to be okay, but just give us some time. Now China, you mentioned the model, but China actually doles out the powers piece by piece and gradually, because you mentioned something about China. China is not the power of the people or the private enterprise that demand the power. Am I correct? Please comment on it. Thank you.
Up for grabs.
You mentioned China.
To be honest, I'm not very knowledgeable on this, but I think the general point about incremental reform is well taken. I think what we need are bargaining structures. A classic mistake that we've made as an international community in Syria, but particularly in Libya and other places, is the rush to elections without building state capacity. Because what that results is you had previously centralized fiefdoms. They translated into decentralized rackets of extraction. So it's a recipe for chaos. You need to have some state capacity, particularly a state like Libya, which was not even a state from the Italian times. They did not create any institutions of governance. And countries that did have some institutions, such as Iraq, were completely disbanded. And I was giving an example to Ishaq yesterday about India. I mean, India gained independence through a national, movement. Nehru came to power. He was opposed to the British, but he did not disband the Indian civil service. He did not disband the Indian army, British Indian army. In fact, the British retained their influence for a few years, gradually changed the direction of their army and their civil service towards the cause of national development. Paul Bremer did exactly the opposite, which was to disband the army. And if you create vacuum, power hates vacuum. So this rush to elections, I think, created a lot of trouble, and we need that gradual approach where we build bargaining structures gradually.
Next is gaps on Dr. Ibrahim, please.
I'm Malik from GAP. Thank you very much for the 3 presentations. The presentations raise in my mind many questions. I have some comments, but I will refrain from the comments. I have a question for Dr. Samer. What do you think the drop in oil prices, what do you think this drop will have as consequences on the countries of origin of migrant workers? Egypt, for instance, relies on migrant workers, and remittances are source of rents. So what would this produce as consequence for the economy of Egypt and for the politics of Egypt? So this is one question. My second question for Dr. Adeel, thank you very much for your presentation. I understood that what you mean is that the solution is not in economic policy measures, or not only in economic policy measures. I think you said your institution, the institutions in the 30s and 40s emphasized conditions of work. It's not only about the creation of employment, but in fact, in order to create this modern private sector, this higher productivity labor force, you need to improve conditions of work, and therefore then you have institutions, the intermediate institutions of unions and so forth. So did I understand well what you meant? That it's not only through economic policy measures that you will create this sort of autonomous private sector. And finally, to Dr. Diwan, do you think really that these reforms in GCC countries can succeed given the linkages between the state and the modern private sector there?
Remittances.
Dr. Ibrahim, good to see you. Well, you are the expert on migration. So, well, as you know, the labor, Egyptian labor in the GCC is not a homogeneous group. There are different groups. There are the skilled labor, unskilled labor, professionals. So the impact differs on the type of labor that goes to the GCC. I expect, obviously, the first question we need to ask ourselves is the drop in price will affect, how to affect the private sector in the GCC countries that is not related to the oil sector. And possibly, I don't know if it has a different position or not, I don't expect it to affect the private sector that is independent from the oil sector. It's possible that we may face a slower demand, but I don't expect it to be substantially slower in the migrant workers. We will see if there are implications in the coming 2 quarters on the economic growth in these countries. The projection is that they'll still remain within their historical average. The difference is only that the amount of surplus has decreased. The the implications on the economics and the politics of Egypt, the economics and politics of Egypt are in a very rocky boat right now, so there are a lot of factors that can affect it, so we cannot really isolate this factor by itself, but if there are tremendous implications on the migration of Egyptian labor to the GCC, then it will definitely add to the strains of the labor market that we have here, and unemployment, and you know the vicious circle of angry young people that do not have jobs. You know what they do? They go to the streets.
But it's also balanced by the fact that they have a lower oil bill when the prices drop down.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch in the coming 2 quarters and the coming year which one will balance it. So.
That's right. I'm going to go actually next to Isha, since we're talking about the GCC, and the question was on the merchant government bargaining structures.
Yeah. Get squeezed, and the private sector, where there are lots of princes, indeed is not touched. And that would be a very negative scenario in the long term. It would polarize the country between the have and the have-nots, and probably radicalize, polarize around maybe identity issues or what have you. It will go down towards rocky politics, or the favorite scenario is where the fact that this strength is shrinking, the government would reduce what the private sector is getting. And there the private sector would have interest to come together as a group and to get something in return, more rule of law, more voice in shaping policy, stronger chamber of commerce or what have you. And as a first step toward the political opening, this would be a positive step. It would take a long time to get to something more representative, but that would be a much more favorable scenario. Now, which of the 2 scenarios we have to watch the briefs and see how it's going. It seems to be going in the direction of the positive scenario right now. But you have to see the succession and how things go.
And for your question for Adeel, can you just briefly remind me of?
No, I mean whether the solution really is in economic policy or the solution is more in political reform.
I see. Is it the chicken or the egg?
Well, I mean, it's really it's in the politics of policy, because policy is always, there is always politics behind the policy.
See, this is exactly what.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Len. Oh.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening presentations. And we're trying to capitalize on your presence here, so we're going to ask you more questions about Egypt. This is what we are all worried about. So from my understanding of the three presentations, the hope is in the private sector to lead the way, to extract voice from the state, and to try to move the balance more towards autonomy for the private sector rather than repression by the government. So what are the chances here for the private sector, especially that there is a lot of potential available? We've been discussing this just before coming in, when they started raising money for the new Suez Canal, 60 billion in 1 week came up. So there's a lot of money there available that's not invested, that's not towards entrepreneurship, that's not in a competitive market at all. How can we encourage the private sector in Egypt to come to the fore, to take a more leading role to get us from where we are? And what's the role of the military institution in the different countries you've been discussing? The military institution in Egypt is competing with the private sector. And the repressive environment, political repressive environment is scaring people away, scaring the private sector away, moving to other countries, maybe moving to the Gulf and Dubai where there are more concessions and more privileges to be gained, and scaring the human capital as well, the knowledgeable, educated youth. They are fleeing, they are trying to grab any opportunity out of this country. So where are we heading, and is there any hope soon?
I need somebody to volunteer to be our sacrificial lamb.
So since I'm Egyptian, I believe in the panel, so I'll take the bullet. It's a very interesting question, and it's an excellent question, if I may say. Now, in my judgment, given the current political situation and the very limited political space, it's going to be a very long bargaining process. You need to create employment. The state is not capable of creating employment any longer. I think it has been like almost 15 years now that the state stopped creating jobs or committing to creating jobs. So you need somebody to create jobs. And you cannot rely on the current, as said, dichotomy of let them go to the informal sector, because it's unproductive, they're very inefficient, they're low wages. So you need someone to pick up the nearly 1 million young Egyptians that go to the labor market. You need someone. And it cannot be the state. Even it cannot be the military arm of the state. Even though now it's picking up lots of mega projects. It's, as you rightly said, it's competing with the private sector in infrastructure projects. It potentially has the impact of scaling away private sector. It will be very interesting to see in the coming years how would this play, because big construction companies, they would like part of the pie. They would like part of the 60 billion. Now, if the army is, or the military institution is taking control of these mega projects, then it's eating the largest part of the pie. So it's part of the negotiations. They will make a statement. It's going to be very obvious in the coming 2 years. We need to be here to create jobs. You want political stability? You need to absorb, you need to create jobs. And we need this part of the pie.
Okay. And sorry, when you answer the question, keeping in mind that in the past years before the revolution, Egypt was growing but not creating jobs.
Sure.
Right, so how do you address that challenge?
Well, I think if there's one country which is ready to discuss, talk and implement some kind of concession, it is Egypt. Because, you've got literally a year of money that comes through and then you plan and so on and so forth. So even 1 year of no cash flow from the Gulf neighbors, the country would be in dire straits. So I think if the elite in this country clearly must be under tremendous pressure, and although economists are versed at predicting, this is one thing one can predict with a lot of confidence, that this is not sustainable. So there must be real pressure to deliver. And I think in delivering, the best I could see, the best model, is to really, rulers in this country should sit down and read what Turgut Özal did in Turkey. And more than the politics, the way he created space for firms, people at the margins, bringing them over. And once you start that process, so that you see, today I was in the Al-Azhar area, and one thing I noticed was throughout the streets, wherever you go, people had a resigned fate. And it was very clear to me that they would sit there for another year, 2 years, 3 years. It's going to come again. Unless you give hope to those marginalized segments, so that, even if there's not something delivered today or tomorrow, but there is a path that laid out, that they could see that there is a path forward. But I think this is one country in the region where the time is rife for concession, and I think the elites are forward-looking. They must really make an effort.
Ishaq?
Yeah, I've done a study on crony capitalism in Egypt. Maybe I can talk about it a little bit. It's fascinating. I think the result of that study would very much suggest that empowering the military economy to kind of lead the way would be a terrible mistake. When you look at the crony capitalists of the past, the firms of Gamal, the 22 and all the firms they own, I got all the corporate data and the like. These companies grow tremendously. So you have a sense of success. They grow by 7 or 8 folds between 2000, on average, from 2003 and 2010. They were getting 70 or 75% of the credit going to the private sector. So you have a sense of success, but however, in the study what I look at is I look at the impact of the growth of this firm on the growth of the rest of the economy. And this is where it hurts, because in every sector where they enter, it kills competition, and all the competitors withdraw, they go under the radar screen, they stop investing, there's no technological progress in these sectors. And by 2010, you can estimate that this to a macro effect that's pretty large, several points of GDP in this growth. And that's the problem was the concentration. The capitalism works with competition. Without competition, it simply doesn't work. Some people make money, and that's all. And so, the solution is more competition. It is to democratize credit so that whoever has a good idea gets the credit. And these big projects that attracts all national saving, or, these are short, could be useful in the downturn to get things moving, but this is not a solution in the medium term.
Could I? One of my students has been raising her arms, and I'll give you the first right to answer, but I'm hoping you can incorporate it. But
that's
and I see others, students of mine, so you have a wasta here, so please.
It ties into what you're talking about very easily. Minna Abdurrahman, I'm currently a researcher at Basira, the Egyptian Center for Public Opinion Research, and what I wanted to ask is slow down, sure. What I wanted to ask is to turn this question around of whether encouraging entrepreneurship and trying to support middle and small enterprises to scaling up would be a more viable solution to basically dilute the dominance of crony capitalism on the economy, rather than trying to dismantle these relationships that have a long history and are known to be very stubborn. Would that induce economic reform more effectively?
This is exactly what I stated, and I would expand on it. But before I do that, let me say that the two really fascinating studies, one by Ishaq, I'm not saying he's here, but really great study on privileges, and then the second study by Raghi Asad from this country, who talked about labor markets. Now, Ishaq, when I read your study, together with Ragi study, it gave me a great irony for this country. And I think this is if there's one point that the media, everybody should concentrate on, it is this. While privileges are concentrated amongst a small number of firms, employment is concentrated amongst the informal sector.
Exactly.
So unless you break this tension, break this divide, people do, even in China there are issues about, corruption at the top, favors go to the firms, but as long as firms are expanding the pie, employing the people, not imposing heavy entry barriers, there is mobility, there's still space. Now, when you talk about the SME sector, remember the SME sector was exposed to very similar cronyism. There are studies coming out which are suggesting how the same people who were part of these big networks, when they saw more money coming from EU and other places under the SME head, they created these shallow, empty shells called SME units, and the ordinary SMEs are not knowing at all what these support programs are. And I would say even SME should be deconstructed. Small firms face a different state. Medium firms face a different state. And we need to unpack and really try to understand what exactly is that SME category that we try and lump together. But you're absolutely right. You've got to create competitors in the system and perhaps give them lobbying power so that they can challenge the big guys. But unless this tension, and I'll say again, employment concentrated amongst the connected firms, the privilege concentrated amongst the connected firms, employment concentrated amongst the informal firms. Creating a model where the firms survive either when they're very close to the state or they're very far from the state. That's the dichotomy. Unless you solve that problem, new social contract, new discussions, meaningless.
Beautiful.
Beautifully said.
I think we should end it here.
May I just...
Let's end it on a high side. Please.
I'll let you end with a high positive note. Thank you. But just to build on what Adeel said, which is, I think, beautifully said, it's about the informal sector in Egypt. I mean, I've been here working at AUCDate for the past 3 years, and every time I got invited to one of these policy advice meetings about what to do with the informal sector, that employs a large part of the labor force, what to do with it. And somebody came up and said, well, we've been discussing this for the past 20 years, and we still haven't done anything about the informal sector. So, in my opinion, the devil in me says, well, it's probably because the political incentive is not there to formalize the informal sector, and because once you formalize it, they start to organize, and once they organize, they'll be able to say, well, you know what, we want a seat on the table of negotiations. We want to be there. We want some of the privileges that people on the top are getting, and it hasn't been not yet.
Any closing remarks? Anybody else? Okay. I'm really indebted for this lovely panel. Samer, under personal ailment, Isha, I really twisted his arm to make him, on top of his long agenda, do this. Adeel changed his flight to be here tonight. But please join me in thanking them and in thanking the person who made sure this lovely event happened, our own Minna Abdul Hamid. Thank you. We'll be having, we'll be in the garden gathering afterwards. Okay, so we'll be gathering over there. If you had a burning question that was not answered, you can approach our panel there. Beautifully said.